As of tonight, the United States has suffered 84,506 reported deaths from coronavirus. And now Donald Trump wants to deny that number. The modeling that has so far proved relatively accurate on the coronavirus spread in the United States says that on August 27th, the day Donald Trump is scheduled to be officially renominated as the Republican Party's candidate for president, the United States of America will have double the number of deaths from coronavirus that it has tonight. On Donald Trump's renomination day, the model now projects that we will have about 160,000 confirmed deaths from coronavirus, and we can be guaranteed that in Donald Trump's nomination acceptance speech that night, that number will be ignored or lied about. Donald Trump has lied about deaths before. The most loathsome lie Donald Trump told as a presidential candidate was that he lost hundreds of friends on 9/11.
How did he keep us safe when the World Trade Center came down? The world, I lost hundreds of friends.
When Donald Trump said that in the South Carolina debate, I immediately tweeted that he was lying. The next day, Donald Trump changed the hundreds of friends to many, many friends. He said that he lost many friends on 9/11, and I immediately tweeted that that was also a lie. The truth is that Donald Trump lost 0 friends on 9/11. 0. He did not attend a single 9/11 funeral, not one. And what he was trying to do for his political gain was to steal the grief of thousands of people who lost family members and loved ones and friends on 9/11. Donald Trump was trying to steal their grief and make it his own and turn it into political currency. And that same Donald Trump is now trying to steal the grief of the thousands of American families who have lost a loved one to coronavirus, the thousands upon thousands of Americans who have lost a friend to coronavirus. Donald Trump wants to steal their grief and make it disappear. Just throw it away. Just pretend that that grief and those deaths do not exist. It is impossible for Donald Trump to dishonor the American dead in this pandemic more than denying the truth of their deaths. To pretend their deaths did not happen is to pretend their lives did not happen. It is to pretend that their lives did not end in a previously inconceivable way, in a hospital bed, alone in a room, no family allowed, no hand-holding at the bedside on that final day, in that final moment, and then no funeral, no memorial service of any kind where the grieving could gather, where they could wrap their arms around each other to try to contain that grief. Donald Trump is going to dishonor all of that. Moral cartographers have in the past believed that they have mapped the extent of the depravity of Donald Trump. But there's always more. Always. Now that Donald Trump's reelection plan is to lie about the number of deaths from coronavirus, Donald Trump knows that he is going to have to publicly disagree with the government's leading expert on the coronavirus, Dr. Anthony Fauci. And so today, Donald Trump decided to do that more forcefully than he has in the past. Donald Trump, using absolutely zero scientific authority or intelligence, today tried to contradict this statement that Dr. Fauci made yesterday in his Senate testimony about reopening schools.
The idea of having treatments available or a vaccine re-entry of students into the fall term would be something that would be a bit of a bridge too far. Even at the top speed we're going, we don't see a vaccine playing in the ability of individuals to get back to school this term. What they really want is to know if they are safe. And that's the question that'll have to be due with what we discussed earlier about testing.
And today, here's what Donald Trump had to say about that.
I was surprised by his answer, actually, because, It's just, to me, it's not an acceptable answer, especially when it comes to schools. The only thing that would be acceptable, as I said, is professors, teachers, etc., over a certain age. I think they ought to take it easy for another few weeks, 5 weeks, 4 weeks, who knows, whatever it may be.
Not an acceptable answer. That's from the person who said this country was going to go from 15 cases of coronavirus straight down to 0 in response to a reporter's question. Not an acceptable answer. That's from the person who America and the world and history must never forget said this.
And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning? Because you see it gets on the lungs and it does a tremendous number of the lungs. So it'd be interesting to check that. So that you're going to have to use medical doctors with. But it sounds interesting to me.